Okay, 1978 Ford Mustang King Cobra. We are getting an entirely new front end. So what does that mean? New tubular control arms from Heidts. Speedway sells a very similar tubular control arm. The only reason why I went with the Heidts is that they could guarantee that it would get here in a month, 2 months, whatever that guarantee was. Speedways, they couldn't guarantee shipment on theirs. And one thing I will say though, this is the Heidts, and so they actually look very similar, but look at those welds. So they do weld this in their at their facility here in the United States. So absolutely beautiful welds. This is the lower control arm, so this is with the strut arm bar here that will allow the strut arm to mount onto this lower control arm, and this mounts directly into the Mustang 2 front end. So if you're looking to do a Mustang 2 front end on a hot rod, you may want to look at a different style control arm, lower control arm. The upper tubular control arm will be the same. The lower might be a little bit different. It won't come back to this small mount here. Usually you'll see an A-shaped lower control arm. And they come with the caps for the grease fittings that you have to install. They're not that big of a pain in the butt, but just remember, do this first. I installed the control arms in the other side, which I'll show you here in a minute, before I put the caps on, and I did not want to take my calipers off or my rotor, or, you know, unpack it's got all new bearings, all new grease, all new fittings on this. So I just didn't want to mess with that and take everything off the spindle in order to put it back. And I really did not want to have to bleed the brakes. So we had a brake bleed issue, and we have bled the brakes on this car 1,000 times before we finally figured out what was going on. So bleeding brakes is not on my list of things to do. So there's the control arms, lower and upper, and Viking dual adjustable coilovers. So that is what's going on there. There's kind of a mixture I found of new and old bolts that you'll end up having to use for the control arms. So this is the current. I know this is really dark. I wish I had better lighting on this side. Let me see if I can grab a light. Let's see if this one works. No, not plugged in. And let's see if we can't get it plugged in. Are we plugged in? Nope. Oh boy. Sorry guys. I'm trying to look to see what I've got here down in my pile of wire mess to see what I just plugged in. And I just realized what I had plugged in is not the light. I plugged in an extension cord. There we go. Yay. Now we're plugged in with the light. The light. Okay. New upper and lower control arms installed. As you can tell, I don't have the rack and pinion arm, steering arm installed yet. I want to leave that loose because they're kind of a pain in the ass. If you install them, you have to keep the key in the ignition in order to turn the spindle. So, tip there, first thing you need to do, take out your rack and pinion steering arms, and it allows you to have a freely rotating, moving spindle and mount here. So, you do not need to take off your rotor caliper, spindle, rotor caliper, bearings, all that good stuff in order to install the control arms. You can leave those on. It does make the spindle very heavy. With that in mind, do you see the brake line right there? That brake line attaches right up here. What you do not want to do is put pressure on that brake line. So you do not ever want to have the spindle be hanging and have the brake line be the one thing that holds this to your control arms. Just be aware that if you are keeping this mounting on, this is going to be heavy. Put your knee up against it in order to keep it from flopping forward, or support it by a jack from the underneath. So you can tell right now I have the control arm supported with the jack. And actually it's not supported all that well with the jack. I don't think it's jacked up. I think it's hanging by itself because now I do have it bolted in. But do you see where the grease boots are? So these are the grease boots. I would definitely install those first before you put the control arms in. I totally forgot about those, got so excited and installed the control arms. Control arms for the upper come with new bolts from Heidts. So just be aware you do not have to use the old bolts that are existing in your Ford. For the lower control arm, the bolt that they sent for the coilovers, Heidts sends a bolt for the coilovers. It's a 1/2-inch bolt for Viking. These are Viking, so I don't know if you can see the Viking coilovers. Durable adjustable. See the little adjustable guys. Use their 1/2-inch bolt for the lower control arm. The 1/2-inch bolts for the lower control arm that Viking sends for theirs has a small little washer that doesn't make any sense, quite honestly. And the bolt is not long enough for this control arm. So, I don't know if you can see that, but you can see the end of that bolt. It does not... Oh yeah, you can see it right there. See that? It doesn't go all the way through. So, just hang on to that bolt. That's an extra part now for you. And as you can tell, the sway bar. So easiest way of dealing with your sway bar in your Mustang, if you're looking at this to do your Mustang, disconnect the sway bar. There are two places it connects on the subframe. There's one right up here, and then there's one on the other side, same position. Disconnect that from the subframe, and that will give you some flexibility with your sway bar, so it's not going to be hanging in the way. Just be careful because it is kind of heavy, and you do have your steering, see where your steering lines are. So that's for my rack and pinion steering fluid, and you definitely don't want to rupture those. Mine probably need to be replaced at some point because I do see some leakage on them, but you know, for now I don't want to rupture them with the sway bar resting on them, so I put a stand underneath the sway bar keeping it up. Okay, what else to keep in mind? Other things to keep in mind when you're doing your front end. Oh yes, when you put the upper control arm on, this is one thing to keep in mind. And here, let me get a hanger for this light, so that way I'm not holding on to it. One thing to keep in mind when you're doing the upper control arm, right here, these bolts, once you mount this in, the upper control arm will be straight out, and actually it looks like it's tipping up. That means all this junk here needs to go way up there to mount, and that's just not going to happen. So once you get these bolts mounted in the upper control arm, loosen this end bolt and that end bolt. It will allow this arm to sag down so that you can fit it into your spindle, and allows you to adjust your upper control arm and where it sits. Same with the lower control arm. So lower control arm bolts up in your subframe in a cross member. And now when I want to get the light out, I can't. Right there, that bolt right there. Now that bolt is not a new bolt. A new bolt is not sent by Heidts, you use your factory bolt for your lower control arm. But back there is where the rubber bushing sits into the control arm, which is pre-mounted for you. You do not need to push the bushing in. Once you get that control arm in and that bolt lined up and through, do not tighten that down. So hand tight, it allows your control arm to move up and down so that you can have some flexibility. Okay, so this is so far the driver's side. It is completely swapped and not bolted up yet. One of the reasons being is that I'm doing the passenger side right now. So just to give you an idea of what the driver's side looks like, let's go back over to the passenger side. And yes, I will mention right away that I did have to use coil compressors, so I thought I could lower the lower control arm and the coil would just fall out. No, that is not the case for the Mustang 2. The coil will not, repeat, will not just fall out. There is a hook on the back side of the coil on the bottom, and it's a lip that the coil sits on. That lip curls halfway up the coil. Once you lower the control arm, that lip will continue to hold the coil in place. The coil will be loose in the front, and yes, tension will be removed from the coil, but not enough to remove the coil and just pull it by hand. So you will need coil removal tools, some kind of a compression tool of some kind to compress the coil just enough to get it out. So for now, why do I have I have no idea why this guy's existing. It probably was from my last brake line, you know, to hold the caliper up. So that's kind of funny. I never cut that off. Anyway, all right, so now it's time to get to work removing bits and parts from this side, and I will do more videos as that comes.